Hi, I'm Gareth Green, and in this video we're going to be considering 4 chord progressions that you might want to avoid. Now I say might want to avoid, I'm hoping we're going to unpack that as we go. In certain harmony textbooks, you often find these things listed. Oh, never go from this chord to that chord, or this chord to that chord. And I just want to interrogate the advice that's often given in those textbooks, just to see, well, is this really valid advice? Is it wise to avoid these things? Should it be something we always avoid, come what may? Are some of these progressions one that's, well, maybe we could use them, but maybe there's reason to be a little bit careful with them. So let's see how we get on with this. First of all, just a little bit of background to the whole question of chords, in case there'll be some people on here who are thinking, well, what do you mean by chords? What do you mean by chord progressions? So quickly, let's just do this. If I am in the key of C major, which all of my examples are, and I've done that simply to avoid the complications of which sharps and flats we might need in other keys, although this is easily transferred to any other key. I'm in the key of C major. I'm going to start by writing out the scale of C major. So here we go. Here are the notes of an octave of a scale of C major. C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. And to form the triads on each degree of the scale, I add a note that's a third above the bottom note, the root note, and a note that's a fifth above it. So there's the first triad. Based on the first note of the scale, C, the first degree of the scale as we call it, C, D, E, 1, 2, 3, that's why E is a third above C, C, D, E, F, G, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that's why G is a fifth above C. And then I carry on doing the same thing here. So the second degree of the scale, D, F, A will be the triad for the same reason. You'll also notice as I'm writing these triads, I either end up with 3 consecutive lines or 3 consecutive spaces. And that's worth noting because it's a quick way to write the notes without having to calculate all these thirds and fifths. But also, if you're thinking, oh, I've got 2 spaces and a line, you know you've made a mistake. Okay, once I've got all my triads, here's the C, D, E, F, G, A, B, back to C. I can number these off. We always number them in Roman numerals. If we just use numbers, well, it might get confused with some fingering or a triplet or a bar number or something. As soon as you see Roman numerals, you know we're talking about chords. Okay, so here they come. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And you might think the next one's going to be 8, but in fact it's 1 again. Why is it 1 again? Well, the notes here are C, E, G. The notes in chord 1 are C, E, G. Same notes. Maybe in a different octave, but it doesn't matter because it's the same note. So in any scale, you've got 7 different chords. Okay, now, if you're sort of thinking, well, I've never seen these before and I've been doing music all my life, it may be you're a guitarist, a keyboard player, somebody who works off a lead sheet maybe, and you'll be singing them written like this. C, D minor, E minor, F, G, A minor, B diminished, and then back to C again at the top there. So it's always the case in a major key that if you write chords 1, 4 and 5, that they are always major chords. So you see C major, F major, G major. When you write chords 2, 3, 6, they're always minor chords, D minor, E minor, A minor. And chord 7 in a major key is always diminished, B diminished. Okay? So if you move to other keys, the same pattern would be true. Okay, well, here's the first progression we're going to consider. One that a lot of textbooks will raise is this one. 2 followed by 1, or in the key of C major, D minor followed by C major. Well, what's wrong with that? Does it sound ghastly? let's have a listen, because what I'm going to do now is to play the chord progression I've written there. And by the way, just in case you're thinking, well, you had 3 notes here, you've got 4 notes there. Chord 2 is D, F, A. All of these notes in chord 2 will be D, F, or A. D, A, F, D. All that's happened is I've used D twice. That's how you get it into 4 parts. You can double up notes, so you could make 4 parts, 5 parts, 6 parts. Often chords are written in 4 parts, but that could be entirely variable. And all of these notes belong to chord 1, C, E, G. So C, G, E, C. You see how I've doubled the C, but all the notes belong to chord 1. So the progression that I've written here sounds like this. Chord 2, chord 1. Well, you might listen to that and maybe you were expecting something ghastly to fall out of the sky when I played that progression. Doesn't sound too bad actually, does it really? I mean, nothing too harmful, is there? And my view of all this stuff is that so much depends on context. If you are writing a piece of music, wanting to write in a particular mood, particular style, where you had things like this, and then maybe you went from there to there, and then you went to there to there, this would sound great because it would all be in the context of that style of piece. If you were writing something that, say, sounded like this, and then you went 2, 1, you might think, well, that sounded quite nice as I was going through it. And then that 2, 1 at the end just didn't sound quite as good. You were just going 2, 1 at the end of that, when I might have gone 5, 1. You might have thought, oh yeah, actually that 5, 1 works much better. In that context, this is the point. It's all about context, isn't it? Okay, what's the objection that the theorists are raising to having this 2, 1 progression? Well, for one, we quite often end up having difficulties with consecutive octaves. So if I've got D in the bass, which I have here, and D in the soprano, then the same 2 parts move on to C. Well, this D followed by C, there may be 2 octaves apart, but it's still called consecutive octaves, whether it's 1 octave, 2 octaves, 3 octaves. Both parts are going D followed by C. So this creates for us something called consecutive octaves. You might know these consecutives as parallels, parallel octaves, exactly the same thing. So we're told in harmony textbooks to avoid writing consecutive octaves. It kind of robs us of the independence of parts. Everybody moving in the same direction by the same interval doesn't give us independence between those 4 parts. And it sounds a bit clunky sometimes when we do that. So, you know, avoid the consecutive octaves or the parallel octaves is a piece of advice you'll often meet. The other one to avoid is consecutive fifths. Now, this is when you have a perfect fifth followed by a perfect fifth. Have a look at the tenor and the bass parts for a moment. Can you see I've got D in the bass and A in the tenor? That's a perfect fifth apart. Now, if you're sort of thinking perfect fifths, you know, are there other kinds of fifths? Yes, there are. If you want to know about intervals, we've got things to help you elsewhere. So I'll refer you to that, and then you could come back to this having looked at our information about intervals. But that's a perfect fifth, and this is then another perfect fifth between the same pair of parts. So you see I've got octaves going on here between the outer parts, I've got fifths going on here between the lower parts, and that's the sort of thing that makes it sound a bit kind of clunky. The other thing is that if you are writing a cadence, in other words the 2 chords that come at the end of a phrase, you probably wouldn't want to go 2-1 because there are certain accepted chord progressions that make up cadences in Western tonal harmony. So if you could go 5-1 or 4-1, you would always choose to do that over 2-1 because 4-1 sounds pretty solid. 5-1 sounds pretty solid. 2-1 sounds slightly less convincing as a cadence at the end of a phrase. If you were going to use 2-1, you would be thinking about doing that in the middle of a phrase. And my advice would be this, that if you can possibly avoid having the top and the bottom going in the same direction as each other, That's the thing that's most likely to help you avoid these consecutives. So say we stick with the same bass line, but we have the soprano part going from D up to E. So E obviously belongs to chord 1, but now the outer parts are not going in the same direction. So we're not going to get that clunky feeling that we get with the consecutives. And if we were, for example, to put the middle parts like that, well, now we've got 2 going to 1, or D minor going to C, and it sounds like this. That sounds better than the original thing with everybody going in the same direction. We've now got some movement in independent directions. So what I'm saying is that when the textbooks say, don't write chord 2 followed by chord 1, you'll end up with consecutives. Well, that's true, you might well, but it's possible to do it in such a way that you don't. So in the right context, if you can avoid the consecutives, well, maybe 2-1 isn't such a sin after all. But it's always worth thinking, well, if I'm dealing with harmonizing the note D, obviously D is at the bottom of chord 2, but D is also in chord 5, and that's a very strong chord. So if you want a strong chord, you might think, well, it'd be better to use 5. D is in 7, that's a diminished chord, so you may or may not want to use a diminished chord. That's another possibility. So if you're doing something like 2-1 and you're thinking, maybe it doesn't sound so good, but I kind of want to keep the 1, well, ask yourself, what's this note that I'm dealing with? It will come in 3 different chords as the root, or the 3rd, or the 5th. Let's try out the other options, see if they're any better. If at the end of that, you're still convinced that you want to go 2-1, stick with it. Okay, but you might decide in this particular situation, if you're going from D to C in the melody, 5-1 might be a better option. So that's 2-1, one of the things that we're often advised to avoid. And, that's the justification for avoiding it, but also potential solutions and thoughts about where you might use it. Now, many of the same arguments are going to apply as we move on through the other so-called forbidden chords. So this chord progression is 6 followed by 1. Okay, well, you can see what we're talking about. Chord 6 is here, it's that A minor chord, A, C, E, and here's 1, C, E, G. So you can see I'm using the A, C, E chord there and the C, E, G chord there. Well, what does it sound like if I write this progression, 6 followed by 1? Well, you might think, again, in the right context, that might be quite nice to do. But you might think, I'm not so convinced by that in the context in which I'm kind of writing stuff. 6-1 doesn't quite convince me. Again, it might be about cadence. If you're writing the last 2 chords of a phrase and you're finishing on chord 1, well, 6-1 is not a recognized cadence. If you're finishing on 1, you're either going to go 5-1 or 4-1. Or you might think, well, I don't really want to finish on 1. I want to finish on, say, chord 5, because if you've got G at the top, G is at the bottom of chord 5, or a G chord. So you might be able to find other solutions by changing the chords. But 6-1 is not a cadence, so often not the best thing to use at the end of a phrase. But if you're going to use it in the middle of a phrase, well, maybe it's possible. Again, you easily fall into trouble with consecutives, because when we look at this, we'll find consecutive fifths between the tenor and the bass part. We'll find octaves between the soprano and the tenor part. We'll also find fifths between the soprano and the bass part. So it's absolutely loaded with consecutives or parallels that we don't really want to be dealing with. And you can kind of see them jump off the page. All the parts are moving up. All the parts moving in the same direction by the same interval is almost guaranteed to throw up some consecutives. So you might be able to find a different solution. I mean, here's one thought here, where I've gone from chord 6-1. And you might be thinking, actually, that sounds a little bit better. How have I managed to do that? Well, I've got the bass leaping this time downwards. So instead of this upwardly, I've decided to go A down to C. I've used common notes. In other words, C is in chord 1 and it's in chord 6. So if you have a common note and you use it in the same part, just repeating it, that's a good idea. E is also a common note because E is in 1 and in 6. So I'm using the two common notes there. The other part is the only one that needs to move. And if you have to move, it's often a good idea to move to the nearest available note. So these two are safe, even though they're repeating. Those two notes are a 6 apart, and you can have consecutive 6. That's absolutely fine. It's only these octaves and fifths you need to watch out for. The bass is leaping a long way, so that's not going to give us anything that's consecutive with those two parts. This part's moving by step, so it's not going to give you any consecutives with the repeated notes or with a bass that's leaping. So suddenly you can go 6 to 1 and not have consecutives. So there is a solution. You might think, yeah, but it still doesn't work at a cadence if it's 6 to 1. That's true. You might also hear that bass part sounds a bit dislocated, jumping such a long way. It suddenly sort of falls off a cliff, doesn't it? Well, one solution to that would be either to bring this bass note down an octave, so you've got, or bring the second bass note up an octave. So you've got this version. So perfectly possible to write 6 followed by 1. I don't think that's an impossible thing. But again, consider the alternatives. Where else do we find C? It's obviously in chord 6, it's in chord 1, it's also in chord 4. So if you were writing these two C's at a cadence, you might well want to go 4, 1. It's much more solid than 6, 1. You can hear that doesn't quite sit comfortably as a chord progression, but 4, 1 sounds much more solid. So if you're writing a cadence, you're probably going to write 4, 1 instead of 6, 1 if you are repeating those C's in this case. You see the kind of alternative strategies. Just think, which notes have I got to deal with? Which other chords would fit those notes? Is that a better solution? And 4, 1 is certainly a cadence formula. 6, 1 isn't. So, you know, if you're going to use it mid-phrase, think, yeah, if I'm happy using 6, 1, let's go for it. But still think, would 4, 1 be better, even if it was in mid-phrase? Or depending on which notes I've got in the melody. I mean, if you're going from E to G, you can't go 4 to 1 because E is not part of chord 4. So then you've got to think, well, what's E part of? You know, so you know, other possibilities. It could go 1, 1, for example, couldn't it? Because E's in 1, and then you could just stick with the same chord. You might think, well, that's better. You could go 3, 1. And you might think, yeah, maybe that's better than going 6 to 1. You know, that's up to you. Anyway, this kind of pros and cons of the advice that we often read. What is the third one? Well, here's the third one. And this is the piece of advice that says, try to avoid going chord 5 to chord 4. Okay, well, the funny thing about this one is that 4 to 5 is often regarded as a strong progression, because if I go 4 to 5, that is a cadence formula. An imperfect cadence finishes on chord 5. So going 1 to 5 or 4 to 5 or 2 to 5 is a very strong progression. 1 to 5 is good. 2 to 5 is good. 4 to 5 is good. That's all good. 5 to 4. Well, again, you might think sounds lovely. Best chord progression I've ever heard in my life. Absolutely fits beautifully in the piece that I'm composing, so I'm going for it. Great. Enjoy. That's good. Context, style, mood. I just come back to those three things. You know, if it works, great. If you're thinking, actually, it doesn't work so brilliantly in the context of a piece that I'm doing. If you're doing, you might think, it doesn't finish very well. But if I finished it off, I've used chord 1 at the end instead of chord 4, you might think, yeah, that sounds much better. So I certainly wouldn't use 5/4 at a cadence. I'd certainly be a little bit cautious about using it mid-phrase if there are alternative progressions that work better. Then you've just got to puzzle out, am I better changing the first chord or the second chord or both of them? You know, but again, one of the difficulties is this, that if I'm going D, C, and I'm going G, F in the bass, which I have to if I'm going 5/4. Well, what have I got then? I'm dealing with D to C, G to F, consecutive fifths. So we've got these wretched things back again. I've also got consecutive fifths between the soprano and the alto, so that's a pain. I've also got consecutive octaves between the alto and the bass, because they're both going G to F. So again, you see the problem that it's so easy to get loaded up with the consecutives. I might say, even when you go 4 to 5, you're going to have exactly the same problem, so you've got to be a bit careful about how you do it. So again, it's the same advice. If you're going to go from 5 to 4, if it's possible to have the bass and the top part going in the opposite direction in contribution, that's always going to help. So when you consider this option, we're going from 5 to 4, going from a chord of G to a chord of F, or the second version, 5 to 4, G to F. Much better when you get that contribution than the first original thing where we've got all those parallels, those consecutives. So there's a bit of thinking on that. But it is interesting that 4 to 5 is a much more satisfactory progression usually than 5 to 4. But if it works in your context and you can possibly avoid those consecutives, great. All right, what's the last one? The last one is 5 followed by 2. Now, again, when you reverse this and you go 2 followed by 5, that's something we quite often do. And it's actually one of the versions of a cadence that finishes on 5, the imperfect cadence, where you can go 1 to 5, 4 to 5, or 2 to 5. So if we go 2 to 5, actually, that's quite a strong thing to do. Works nicely as a cadence. It's what I call a kind of comma cadence. It doesn't signify the end of the piece, but it kind of signifies the end of a phrase that's moving on to something else. But 5 to 2 doesn't work quite so convincingly. So here's 5 to 2. And again, exactly as before, what do? We easily end up with octaves, G to D in those two outer parts. We've got fifths going on here with the G in the bass, D in the tenor, D in the bass, A in the alto. So that's a bit of a pain as well, isn't it? So you see what happens. It can quite easily end up with these consecutives or parallels. But watch out, because this should jump off the page. All 4 parts moving in the same direction by the same interval is almost bound to chuck up these parallels or consecutives. So if you're going to do this, you've got to find a different way of doing it so you don't end up in that pickle. So again, by organizing the parts writing, so for example, if you're going to go from a G to a D, and you're thinking, well, if it's possible for me to do something like D to F in the top part, well, that's probably going to help me avoid trouble. So if you did something like that, you can see I've got in the top 2 parts a fifth followed by a sixth, so that's all right. Between the top and the tenor, they're going in consecutive thirds, that's all right. The top and the bottom are going in opposite directions. The alto and the tenor, 6 followed by a fifth, so that's all right. The alto and the bass, they're going in opposite directions, that's fine. Tenor and the bass, a third and an octave, that's fine. So it's perfectly possible to go from that 5 to 2. And it could sound really quite nice if you went 5 to 2 and then 5 to 1. To my ears, that sounds perfectly good. You might be able to organize things as I have done here. A common note there between the D and the D that belongs to the chord 5 and the D that belongs to the chord 2. So, you know, that being a common note to both these chords, if you use it in the same part, that's going to help avoid those consecutives because the bass is going down a fourth, the top part's repeating, the middle 2 parts are going in the same direction by the same interval, but they're a 6 apart, so that's absolutely fine. So I hope you're kind of picking up on my thoughts on these rules. When you see these absolute prohibitions stated in a textbook, well, it's kind of advice worth considering. Certainly advice worth heeding in many a situation. But if you can use it without bumping into those problems at a cadence, if you can use it without bumping into those problems with consecutives, well, is it such a bad thing? Always ask yourself, if you get these 4 progressions, is there a better alternative? Often when it comes down to it, the answer is that yes, actually, it does actually sound better to do this instead of one of these progressions. That's the acid test. If something sounds better, go for it. Why would you want to take a weaker option when a stronger one exists? But if you think, actually, considering everything here, it does work without having any technical problems, it works in the style, in the context, with the mood I'm trying to create, and it's the best possible option, go for it. Because at the end of the day, that is what matters. What is the musical result of this? So there we are, a kind of consideration of commonly offered advice by wonderful theorists for whom I have the greatest respect, because they're coming from a place that kind of makes common sense. But actually, I'm just questioning it as well and saying, well, there are instances in which some of these progressions work perfectly well. So use them with great care. And if they work for you, go for them. And if you're thinking, actually, there's a better alternative, go for that. Well, I hope this video has been helpful, and if you found it so, you might want to go to our website, www.mmcourses.co.uk. Lots of resources on there, courses, maestros, merch, all sorts of things. So you might want to have a good old dig around with that. If you're really kind of getting into all of this, you might consider joining our Maestros program. There are 3 levels of Maestros, nothing to do with ability levels, by the way, they're levels of engagement. So level 1 is a kind of support level. You engage with us a bit more closely. There are all sorts of perks that go with that are rather good. With level 2, you have all the level 1 perks. In addition, you get access to a monthly live stream where you can meet with me online. There's a live chat going. You can ask your questions. I try to make a lot of teaching input. We cover lots of different musical topics. You might want to go a stage further, become a level 3 member. That gives you discounts off courses. It gives you an extra live stream, so you have all the level 1 and level 2 benefits, but you come on for an additional live stream every month that follows on from the level 2 live stream, and that's very specifically for you to be able to submit your own work. So if you're composing something, doing a harmony exercise, learning a piece, performing, and you want some feedback, you can send in your score and or recording or whatever, and I will offer you some personal evaluation. We share all of that with the group. It's an incredibly encouraging group. It gives you a kind of peer group to sit alongside. You learn so much from seeing and hearing what other people are writing and performing, give you loads of ideas for your own development, and it's a lovely space in which to share musical ideas. So lots of other perks come with Maestros as well. So you just click on Maestros on the homepage. You can discover everything you need to know about that. And I hope you'll consider joining us. It would be lovely to have you with us. Anyway, lots to look at. www.mmcourses.co.uk.